Before we start, do you have any questions for me? No.
Not yet. I know about your project. You mentioned it to me. I have not seen your questions, but you can just ask them to me.
All right. Well, one of the first questions, most popular questions, must be how are we doing um, uh, as a country in the Netherlands right now? So, if you think of the Netherlands, what are the first things that come in mind when we talk about education?
It is a very dynamic and diverse education system compared with other countries. Its overall performance is really quite good. When I look at the PISA comparisons, Dutch students always perform well. It costs very little, so the Netherlands doesn't invest as much in education as other countries, but students do quite well. It's not so great when it comes to social equality. Like we can see that the social background from which students come still has a very strong influence on the success of the education system. So that's an area to improve. But no, overall, I think the performance of the Netherlands is good. And what I like in the Netherlands is that you offer lots of different approaches to education. It's not just one size fits all model, but you can find really very interesting pedagogies in many places.
Yeah, I read your report, two ones, huh? World Class.
Uh huh.
Tomorrow I'm talking to Yong Zhao, and he wrote a book, World Class Learners. It's pretty close to,
All
it's
right.
almost the same title. Anyway, you spent well a chapter on Dutch diversity, so that's
Yeah.
exactly what you just mentioned. Are there any other flagships of Dutch education apart from diversity?
Again, I think overall the quality of overall learning outcomes is good. I think in the country, at least Netherlands scores quite well in our PISA comparisons, and it's not just diversity; it's also innovation. If you have a great idea as a teacher or as a school, there's more room for you in the Netherlands to realize that idea than in France or Germany, the big neighbors. And I think that's a great asset of the system that it values originality, entrepreneurship in the education system more so than other education systems. On the kind of the counter side to this is that students are still better in reproducing what they have learned rather than to apply their knowledge to novel situations. I think you can see that there is still a lot of memorization going on in Dutch classrooms, more than you might think is necessary or good in the times in which we live.
Well, there are different approaches. There are different. Last year, I interviewed Edie Hirsch, and he's an advocate of knowledge. He says
I know.
knowledge is a prerequisite for skills. Without knowledge, there are no skills. So, in I've saw many of your presentations and talks on YouTube, and you always refer to the education for the industrial world and the world of tomorrow as two opposites. So you are, I think, part of the last of the latter proponent. Am I right?
Yeah, I'm not arguing. I don't think it's. I think it's wrong to see knowledge and skills as two opposing parts of a spectrum. I think that's just a very poor way of thinking about the problem. I think knowledge and skills are complementary, and we need to look at them as two sides of the same coin. But what I think loses very rapidly in value is shallow content knowledge. The world no longer rewards you just for what you know, but for what you can do with what you know. That's where the skills dimension comes in. And for example, can you think like a scientist is becoming more
Mhm.
important than knowing lots of facts about physics and chemistry. Can you think like a mathematician? Can you take a real world problem, translate it into the mathematical world, solve the problem in the mathematical world? It does require knowledge, but that knowledge comes more in the form of conceptual understanding than in the form of learning sort of certain formulas or equations by heart. And we do too much of the latter. Thinking like an historian. Do you understand how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it has developed, how is it advanced, how sometimes it unravels when the context changed? That is more important than
Mhm.
knowing lots of names and places. So, yes, if you do not understand the ideas of a discipline, if you do not have that conceptual understanding and knowledge, Google doesn't help you. That's very clear. In that sense, I agree with E.D. Hirsch and people like this. You need to understand the structures of the disciplines. But that's not what we do in education. In education, we fill up people with very shallow content knowledge. There's lots and lots and lots of stuff, which people all forget. And we spend too little time on the foundations of a discipline.
You write blogs for Teachers Magazine, and one of the quotes that you do a lot is these skills this knowledge we teach kids today are really easily replaceable by machines and artificial intelligence. And Charles Fadell, I interviewed him a couple of months ago, and he said there's too much or discussion. It's it's knowledge and skills, and yet you say so many schools are still focusing only on knowledge. How come?
Well, because it's very convenient, and it's the kind of things that are easy to test, easy to teach, are the ones that are quickest disappearing from our labor markets. But our kind of the goalposts in education keep the status quo. You can talk to teachers about innovative learning environments and creative pedagogy and so on, but at the end of the day, students ask themselves, what do I need to know for the exam? And as long as the exams keep us as prisoners of the current ways of thinking, teachers in schools will not change that. And I think that's the problem. The world is changing, but our school systems, in particular the gateways, the exam systems and so on, they keep us really as prisoners in a very industrial kind of way of working. And so in a way, that's, I think, the result.
What can PISA do? What can your organization do in order to accelerate this process, the needed process?
Yeah, actually, we do a lot in this space. Like, for example, PISA has from the very beginning put the emphasis on competency as opposed to simply knowledge. So to solve a PISA task, you need to be able to think like a mathematician. You need to be able to connect the real world and the mathematical world. So in that sense, PISA has always promoted an approach where knowledge and skills were integrated.
From the start, from 95 on.
From the year 2000, actually, that was one of the founding ideas of PISA, to build this on the concept of competency. But as time went by, we've done much more than that. For example, in our last assessment, we assessed social skills. We didn't look at just can you solve problems on your own, but we looked at whether students can work together to solve problems. And those social skills and emotional qualities are rising in importance. They're not yet valued in school systems in our metrics, but in life, your curiosity, your courage, your leadership qualities, they play a very, very important role. So we are starting to build metrics on those things. And I know some people question that. Some people say, well, why do you test collaborative problem solving? That's not what we teach. Well, we should think about those questions. At the moment, in 2018, we assess global competency.
Yes.
Can you see the world through different lenses, appreciate different ways of thinking, different cultures? In the world in which we live, and Europe is a great illustration. Europe has always thrived when different cultures were meeting and different ways of thinking were emerging. That's been the strength of Europe. But we don't teach that to students. We often teach them to think in one silo of a specific field. So PISA assesses this with global competency. In 2021, we're going to assess creative thinking. So PISA is always trying to sort of push education systems to think harder about what it means to be human in the 21st century.
Creative thinking and critical thinking. I know many schools are moving towards a curriculum that implements those topics. The thing is, most schools don't know how to assess creative thinking, and that's really difficult. And when I talk to scholars like Robert Marzano, when I talk to scholars like Michael Fullen, it's really, we don't have a definitive answer on what is creativity and how do we measure it. So how does PISA approach, how are you going to measure creative thinking in 2021?
Yeah, I would make the same argument about mathematics. We don't. Can you tell me actually what mathematics really is as a fundamental idea of philosophy or history? No, actually we've just done certain things for many centuries, and therefore we take something for granted. And in creativity, we are just starting with the same process. But I think, the perfect can always be the enemy of the good. The idea of, first we need to have the golden, bulletproof idea of what creative thinking is because before we can start to assess it. I think that's the wrong approach. I do think this is a process of experimentation. I give you an example. In 2003, we started in PISA with the assessment of problem-solving skills. That was also, by that time, we didn't actually have a kind of scientific definition of problem solving. Everybody knows what we have an intuitive understanding of problem solving, but not something that we could ground in science and theory. Well, we started with assessing it, and then we improved and developed the assessment. In 2012, we came up with a better version. In 2015, we added collaborative problem solving. For me, the idea of conceptual development and measurement goes hand in hand. And my background is physics. Yeah. That's how we work in physics. In physics, you don't wait until you understand the world. You actually try to sort of understand the world by measuring progress, and you improve your measures while you observe change. And I think in education, we take for granted what we've done for centuries. We accept it, not because we know it's theoretical right, but only because we've always done it this way. And when there is a new idea like creative thinking, we say, wait. First you have to establish centuries of evidence. I really believe, the 21 assessment of PISA of creative thinking will not be perfect. It will not be, fully rooted in theory. But it's going to help us to develop the kind of theories that we need. And that's how I believe we should approach the field of assessment. I think that the mistake we make by not assessing creativity and social emotional skills is much more serious, because the message we are sending to teachers and students and parents is that, talk about those things, but they're soft skills. That word already conveys, that's not really the essence of success. And I think, measurement is one tool to create greater awareness.
Well, don't you agree with me that I talked to Professor Renzulli, and he did a lot of work on giftedness. And he said, I hope we don't get to the point where we actually put a number on creativity. I mean, that generates inequality in other ways as well, right?
Well, but you could make the same argument about mathematics,
of course,
or science.
Of course,
and I think by putting a number on it, you actually see what, I think it's very hard to change what you can't see. And sometimes, the picture you see is very blurred and very kind of, one-colored and so on. I accept all of that. But it's by looking that you try to improve your seeing skills. And I think if we miss out on measuring creativity, we are not going to give teachers better tools to see where creative thinking emerges or not. We're not going to give, in a way, an education without measurement is always an education about the elites, because it values those who succeed by nature. It will not help, those who struggle. And I think measurement is a very important tool to put everyone on the radar screen and to give teachers the eyes and ears to see what students know and don't know in their kind of classes.
So talking about quality and inequality, yesterday I had an interview with Charles Murray, and he is the author of The Bell Curve. Maybe you know the book. It was highly controversial in '94 because he did research together with Richard Herrnstein on IQ and educational outcomes. And in his opinion, he says, well, the educational system is pushing children to pursue an academic career and pushing them to do reading and writing, while the IQs predict that it's not going to work for them. What do you think of that approach? Have you ever tried to map the world according to IQ standards?
Well, if they were right, then how could you explain that a country like Poland has seen so dramatic improvement in its learning outcomes in PISA? Or, why should Swedish schools fall behind? Or why should, Japanese and Chinese schools see so much educational progress? If this was to be all IQ, the world would be frozen. You could explain some cross-country differences, maybe with some elaborate theory in genetics, but at the end of the day, the remarkable improvement that we've seen across countries, in some countries, shows us actually we can change those outcomes. And I think the most dangerous, and I give you an example. In one of our PISA surveys, we ask students, what do you believe makes you successful in mathematics? And, some students say, well, that success is inherited, I'm born as a genius, or I will study something else. So that's basically the fixed mindset that you grow up when you believe in genetics. And surprise, surprise, it is those countries where students hold those beliefs that actually you see the largest disparities. You see people following the bell curve. If you ask the students the same question in Japan and Singapore, 9 out of 10 students tell you, if I study really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. And surprise, surprise, you don't see as much disparities in mathematics outcomes in those countries.
So that fixed mindset is a big problem in education.
Absolutely. But a fixed mindset comes out of the belief that certain skills are inherited rather than learned. And we make this argument actually about reading and math. We've sort of accepted they can be learned. But when it comes to social emotional skills, creativity, resilience, problem-solving skills, teamwork, we often treat them as character qualities. And so character traits, things that you cannot change, that are inherited. I don't think there's any evidence supporting that. We simply don't know, and maybe we learn them in different ways. And I do believe the role of education is to see how we can change things, not just, the fixed mindset, as I think, is the greatest barrier to educational improvement at an individual level and at a system level.
Yeah, Charles Murray told me, well, he was asked a question, should people know their IQs? And he said no, because they don't know how to handle it. Yeah. Because if you know you're at the mean, if you have an IQ of, let's say, 100, you're not really likely to become a really successful businessman in your mind. But you might be at the 95th percentile, for example. But people just have this fixed mindset.
Well, you see, I think it's the IQ, the notion of the IQ postulates the fixed mindset. And I was wrong. Last week I spent time with Richard Branson and his family. He was a school dropout at age 14, total failure in the traditional school system. He became one of the most successful entrepreneurs because the one thing that school did not destroy is his belief in the possibilities. And in a sense, I think we should look, I accept the notion of an IQ as one dimension of success. I don't think the IQ is, determining what you can do academically, and certainly not what you can do socially in many, many respects. And I think a good education is about finding the qualities, including IQ, of all of the people. No?
And of course, this IQ is talking about groups, and in education we talk about individuals, of course. Yeah. And you're an individual, and you are not a mean or a standard deviation. You are a unique person. Well, I was wondering, and I wrote you the question, but you didn't read them. So, when we talk about the top scoring countries, we always go to Southeast Asia, Finland. Brazil is coming up as a really high performing country. What about Africa? I never hear countries like Ghana or Zimbabwe. What about Africa?
Actually, I must say honestly, I have very little knowledge about those countries. The only countries for which we now have data are Senegal, Zambia, Tunisia, Morocco. So we are just starting to work in the African continent. And so that's really, I think, a weakness of our systems.
So why? Why is that emerging now?
Well, because our comparisons, including PISA, are really voluntary. It's basically the countries who decide whether they want to do this or not. And I think in Africa, there's only been very recently interest in those kinds of comparisons.
The world is globalizing, and students have never been so much alike as nowadays, all connected and showing the same characteristics. If you had to design a global school, and you were a principal of the global school, and people from all over the world would be attending your global school, teachers, pupils of all ages, what would be the core qualities of your school? What best practices would you bring in such a school?
Well, if I think of a global school, I wouldn't think of a school where everybody is the same, wherever they come from. I would try to find out what are the specific strengths that students from different cultures and parts of the world actually bring to education, because I see diversity as really the strengths of modern societies. And innovation is always about connecting the dots, basically finding the ideas that you can't see from your own way of thinking. And as a global school, I think it will be a fantastic opportunity to have just more diversity, more ways of thinking, more ways of working that you can draw on. And I think that's where I would see, I think, the future coming from, and you can do that across the disciplines. Basically the capacity of students to think across the boundary of disciplines, to look at problems, through the lens of a biologist and through the lens of a philosopher. That's when new ideas are being created. And the same about cultures. I must say, the biggest privilege for me has been I've been in classrooms in 60 countries, and I know all the numbers, but that's where I really learned what is behind those numbers. And I was 2 weeks ago on my way to Australia in Bhutan. I'd never, known much about this country. I was absolutely impressed, and I learned so much in a few days. I think that's where I think a global school could be really successful. I think that the danger.
What were you so impressed about then in Bhutan?
Well, I think I saw how unidimensional our approach to education and also success in life is. Really what I saw in Bhutan is where questions around student well-being had the same importance as of academic success, where the collective achievement was valued as much as individual achievement. And you could see that happening in schools. So, and the most impressive thing is that everybody seemed to be very, very, very content with this. So there you could really see nobody was off the radar screen. And I had not seen that before, and I had not been to that country before. But I think every country can bring something to the table. And the worst version of a global school would be simply, a one-size-fits-all meshed curriculum. Mm-hmm. The best global school would be one which actually capitalizes on those different ways of thinking, ways of working, cultures, and ideas.
Who are the new stars when we talk about countries, rising stars? Apart from Finland, we always talk about Finland, South Korea, Japan.
Well, it depends really what you're looking towards. I think clearly parts of China are very impressive. The way they actually also develop a more holistic sense of student success. I think we can learn from that. I think almost any country. I wouldn't know sort of a single country where I see sort of there on the rising. But I think in countries like Colombia, like Peru, like Guatemala, Ecuador, I've seen very, very impressive developments. And I think we should, our role as researchers should be not to predict certain successes, but to have an open eye and an open heart, really, to see where the real important evolutions are.
I have 3 more questions. One is, Charles Murray advocates for a system where we skip the BA. He says the bachelor is such an obsolete way of showing how competent you are. He advocates for certificates for small parts so that everybody, except not only the people from Stanford and Harvard and MIT can show they're competent, but somebody in China or in India with the same certificate can show his or her competence. What do you think of the system, of the diplomas we have now? Is it still relevant?
Well, I think it's a relic of a long gone past, very clearly. We have designed those systems when access to education was limited. Only a few people could succeed, and those certificates were the ones to actually. I think the future is not just with giving people more modular certificates. The future is to give people real ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. And the future may be not with institutions, The future maybe you may learn digitally, you learn with friends, you learn in a university, you learn at the workplace. And I think lifelong, life-wide learning isn't about institutions. And it isn't about, upfront learning. It's about developing this growth mindset that every day we find new opportunities. And I think the certification is an important part of this. And there I agree, with Mari, that we should have more modular, more competency-based ways of accreditation. And first and foremost, get rid of the kind of reputationally based metrics, that what Harvard offers you is largely a reputation. We don't even know to what extent that reflects the inherent quality of skills. I agree with Mari. That's important to break that kind of monopoly. But I do think even more important is that we create, true lifelong learning, which give people themselves the ownership over their learning.
We are designing in Holland. We are redesigning our national core curriculum to make it more future-proof. A very very select group of teachers, I must say, are redesigning standards. What advice do you have? Because you've done it so many times. There must be some standard formulas that, well, things that people shouldn't forget when designing a future-proof curriculum. What do you have to say to those people?
Well, think less about. It's always easy to design a curriculum for our past. It's always difficult to design a curriculum for our children's future. If we want to design a curriculum for tomorrow's world, we have to have a good sense of tomorrow's world. We have to develop the eyes and ears to see how the world is changing in social life and economic life. And what I would advise is, don't look back to the academic disciplines. They can be a useful tool to inform and look forward, look outward to the world, and particularly try to find a good balance between the academic, the social, and the emotional kind of knowledge and skills.
In the end, it's also when PISA says we are going to assess global competencies in 2021, and companies say, well, we're not, a diploma from Harvard is not everything anymore. We're going to assess your skills, actually. That's going to change a lot as well. Because when countries notice they're not doing well in reading and writing, they are designing programs so they will do better on the next PISA test. It's that's kind of a fact. So when you say we are going to pay attention to global competencies, I hope it's going to start up a movement within schools. What do you think? Is it going to happen?
I hope so. I actually think that this industrial model of schooling, where you had someone at the top deciding what everybody is doing, that's sort of not, just inefficient, but it's losing relevance. I think we, rather than pushing new ideas into schools, we need to become much better at finding the good ideas in schools and spreading and scaling them. I think that's where the future of education really lies, and I think that's possible. And I do think that PISA can give people inspiration. The fact that in Holland you now talk about competency-based learning, that actually has a lot of its origin in those decisions that were early made. And I hope that PISA can accompany that progress and encourage people to think about competencies that they might find are difficult to grasp and measure. But unfortunately, I must leave in a very short while to go to another office.
I see. Well, let me end by saying my last question was about the global challenges, the most important global challenges that we are facing right now, and one must be climate. But am I forgetting anything else?
Well, I think the climate change, I think, is obvious. But I do think the challenge of inequality is real as well. In the past, if you think about in the kind of industrial age in which we are sort of still living, everybody had an ascribed role. Everybody played a function, and that's why we educated everybody in school. In a world of artificial intelligence, technology may super empower a few people to do great things. Those who are sort of advantaged may get further advantage, and those who are not may be left way, way, way behind. And therefore, I do think the role of education and fostering greater levels of equity is, I think, at least as important as the foundations of climate change.
I see. Well, I always ask my interviewees, who should I interview next? Who do you think is a good candidate for when it comes to educational change?
I don't, you've read Homo Deus?
Yeah. Harari's.
Harari. I think he would be I think he has asked the right question. He's not a specialist on education, but he asked the right questions. And I think many of his questions are very relevant for education.
Well, thanks a lot for your time, Mr. Schleicher.
Pleasure to meet you here.
You were a great help. Have a good day.
Thanks. Same for you.
Bye.